It began with anger that had been building for years, then suddenly turned into one of the most violent uprisings in modern Chinese history. At the end of the 19th century, China was not a unified story of strength. It was a country under pressure, politically weakened, economically exploited, and increasingly influenced by foreign powers. What followed was not just a rebellion, but a dramatic clash between tradition, nationalism, foreign intervention, and imperial ambition. This was the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. But to understand why thousands of people rose up in violence, we need to go back before the rebellion itself, into the decades of humiliation and tension that made it possible. By the mid-1800s, China's Qing dynasty was already struggling. Internally, it faced corruption, rebellions, and economic instability. Externally, powerful European nations and Japan were expanding their influence across Asia. After the Opium Wars, China was forced into unequal treaties that opened ports, allowed foreign trade control, and granted special privileges to foreign powers. These agreements created something deeply resented inside China. Foreign powers were not just trading in Chinese cities, they were building spheres of influence. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan each carved out areas where they controlled trade, railways, mining, and political influence. Foreign soldiers, missionaries, and merchants were increasingly present inside Chinese territory. To many ordinary Chinese people, this felt like a slow loss of sovereignty. Foreign missionaries in particular became a source of tension. They built churches, spread Christianity, and were often protected by foreign military power. Local traditions, religious practices, and authority structures were increasingly challenged. In rural areas, rumors and resentment began to grow. At the same time, natural disasters made life even harder. Floods, droughts, and famines struck different regions, increasing poverty and instability. Many peasants felt abandoned by the Qing government and threatened by foreign influence at the same time. This combination of economic pressure and cultural fear created a volatile environment. It was in this environment that a secret society began to grow in northern China. They were known as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, later called the Boxers by Western observers, because of their martial arts practices. At first, they were not a unified army or political movement. They were loosely organized groups that practiced traditional fighting techniques and believed in spiritual rituals that they thought could protect them from harm. Over time, their beliefs became more political. The Boxers began to see foreign influence, especially Christianity and Western presence, as the root of China's problems. They believed that removing foreigners and foreign influence would restore balance and strength to the country. Their slogan reflected the shift: support the king, destroy the foreigner. Interestingly, the Boxers were not initially against the Qing dynasty itself. In fact, they claimed to support it. This made the situation more complex because the Qing government itself was divided. Some officials saw the Boxers as dangerous rebels, while others saw them as useful allies against foreign pressure. As Boxer activity increased in northern China, violence began to spread. Foreign missionaries and Chinese Christians became targets of attacks. Churches were destroyed. Railways and telegraph lines were sabotaged. The situation escalated quickly, especially in rural areas where government control was weaker. Foreign powers became increasingly alarmed. They demanded protection for their citizens and compensation for damages. Military forces from different countries were already stationed in key coastal cities, and tensions were rising steadily. By 1900, the situation reached a breaking point. The Boxer movement had grown stronger, more organized, and more aggressive. Meanwhile, parts of the Qing government began to openly support them, believing they could be used to push back foreign influence. This decision would have major consequences. In June 1900, Boxer forces entered Beijing. At the same time, Qing imperial troops and Boxer groups began attacking foreign legations, the diplomatic compounds where foreign diplomats lived and worked. What followed was a siege that shocked the world. Foreign diplomats, soldiers, and civilians were trapped inside the legation quarter in Beijing. They were surrounded by Boxer forces and Qing imperial troops. Supplies were limited. Communication with the outside world was cut off. For several weeks, they held out under constant pressure, unsure if help would arrive in time. Outside Beijing, foreign powers reacted quickly. an international coalition was formed, including troops from Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, and others. Their goal was to relieve the siege and restore control. But the journey toward Beijing was not simple. As foreign forces advanced inland, they faced resistance, logistical challenges, and uncertainty about the strength of Boxer and Qing forces. The conflict was no longer a small uprising. It had become an international military intervention inside China. Meanwhile, inside China, the situation was becoming more chaotic. The Qing leadership was divided. Some officials supported continued resistance against foreigners, while others feared total collapse. This internal division weakened coordination and made the situation even more unstable. As the siege continued, both sides prepared for what would come next. Inside the legation quarter, defenders organized limited resources, fortified positions, and waited for relief. Outside, Boxer forces maintained pressure, believing they were defending China from foreign invasion. And in the wider country, uncertainty spread as the conflict escalated beyond control. By mid-1900, the Boxer Rebellion had transformed from a local uprising into a major international crisis. What began as a grassroots movement in northern China had now drawn in the world's great powers, turning Chinese territory into the center of a global confrontation. And as foreign armies moved closer to Beijing, the fate of the rebellion and the Qing dynasty itself was about to be decided in ways that would reshape China's future forever. As foreign armies pushed deeper into China, the conflict entered a far more destructive and decisive phase. What had started as a siege in Beijing was now becoming a full-scale international military intervention, with multiple powers advancing toward the capital from different directions. The goal was simple on paper: relieve the foreign legations, defeat Boxer forces, and force the Qing government to restore order. But on the ground, nothing was simple. The Eight-Nation Alliance, made up of troops from Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, began coordinating a joint advance toward Beijing. Each country had its own motivations, its own priorities, and its own long-term interests in China. This alliance was not built on trust, but on urgency. The immediate goal of survival for their diplomats had temporarily united rival empires. As the relief force moved inland, resistance from Boxer groups and Qing-aligned forces continued. In some areas, the fighting was disorganized, with local militias and imperial troops acting without clear coordination. In other regions, resistance was more determined, slowing the advance and forcing foreign troops to adapt to unfamiliar terrain, supply shortages, and harsh summer conditions. The march toward Beijing was not a straight path. It was a slow, tense advance through villages, river crossings, and fortified positions. Foreign troops often encountered abandoned settlements, burned infrastructure, and signs of earlier clashes. The Boxer movement, though lacking modern weapons and centralized command, relied heavily on numbers, local knowledge, and surprise attacks. Inside Beijing, the situation remained critical. The foreign legation quarter had now been under siege for weeks. Food supplies were running low, medical conditions were deteriorating, and constant pressure from surrounding forces created a sense of uncertainty. Defenders relied on improvised fortifications, rationing systems, and coordinated defensive fire to hold their position. Communication with the outside world was almost completely cut off, leaving them unsure when or if relief would arrive. At the same time, the Qing court itself was undergoing internal crisis. Empress Dowager Qiqi and senior officials faced impossible decisions. Some advisors urged continued resistance against foreign forces, believing the Boxers could still push back imperial influence. Others warned that the rebellion had spiraled beyond control and would lead to devastating consequences if not stopped. This internal split weakened the Qing response. Instead of a unified strategy, there was hesitation, conflicting orders, and inconsistent military coordination. Some Qing units actively supported Boxer forces, while others attempted to distance themselves or quietly avoid direct confrontation with foreign armies. In mid-August 1900, the turning point finally arrived. After weeks of fighting and movement, the Eight-Nation Alliance forces reached Beijing and launched a coordinated assault on the city. The defense around Beijing collapsed under the combined pressure of foreign troops advancing from multiple directions. Boxer resistance, although still present in some areas, could not match the firepower, coordination, and discipline of the invading forces. The siege of the legation quarter was broken. Foreign diplomats and civilians were finally relieved after weeks of isolation. The immediate crisis that had triggered international intervention was over. But what followed was not stability, it was occupation. Foreign troops entered Beijing and established control over key areas of the city. Boxer groups were driven out or dispersed. In the aftermath, widespread reprisals took place. Many Boxer participants and suspected supporters were captured or killed. Villages associated with the movement faced harsh punishment. The violence that had begun as an uprising now extended into a broader phase of retribution. The Qing government, weakened by the crisis, was forced to negotiate under extreme pressure. The result was the Boxer Protocol of 1901, one of the most severe treaties imposed on China at the time. It demanded large financial reparations, allowed foreign troops to be stationed in Beijing, and required punishment of officials linked to the Boxer Uprising. The consequences were deeply damaging for the Qing dynasty. The financial burden of reparations placed long-term strain on the Chinese economy. The presence of foreign troops in the capital was a symbol of weakened sovereignty, and the internal instability exposed during the rebellion further reduced confidence in the Qing government's ability to rule effectively. But the impact went beyond politics and economics. The Boxer Rebellion also changed how China was viewed internationally. It reinforced the image of a country under internal pressure and external control, vulnerable to foreign intervention. At the same time, it intensified nationalist feelings within China itself. Many people began to question not only foreign influence, but also the structure of the Qing system that had failed to prevent such a crisis. In the years that followed, the rebellion became a turning point. Reform movements gained momentum. Intellectuals and reformers began calling for modernization of the political system, military, and education. The idea that China needed deep structural change, not just temporary stability, became increasingly widespread. The events of 1900 had exposed how fragile the existing system had become. For the foreign powers involved, the rebellion also carried lessons. While the Eight-Nation Alliance achieved its immediate objectives, the cost and complexity of coordinating multiple empires inside China revealed the difficulties of imperial competition. Each power had its own interests, and while they had cooperated temporarily, underlying rivalries remained unresolved. Russia and Japan in particular would later continue competing for influence in East Asia, with tensions eventually leading to further conflict in the region. The Boxer Rebellion had not resolved imperial competition. It had only temporarily redirected it. In the long view of history, the Boxer Rebellion stands as more than just an uprising. It was a collision of old and new worlds, traditional beliefs, nationalist anger, imperial expansion, and global politics all converged in a single crisis. It showed how local resistance movements could escalate into international conflicts when global powers were already deeply involved in a region. And it also marked a moment of transition for China. The Qing dynasty, already weakened, emerged from the rebellion even more fragile. Within a little over a decade, it would collapse entirely, ending centuries of imperial rule and opening the path toward revolution and the modern Chinese state. The Boxer Rebellion did not begin as a world-shaping event, but by the time it ended, it had changed the balance of power, exposed the limits of imperial control, and set in motion forces that would reshape China in the 20th century. It was not just a rebellion. It was a warning that the world of empires was entering a new and unstable era where resistance, global intervention, and internal collapse could all collide at the same time.